Hello everybody, now it's time to make the brakes. Bring up the gizmo and from the gear menu, select Cylinder 3D. Rotate it 90 degrees, scale it up and press QC50. Mask off the bottom and increase the size of the top. Hold the Control key and move with the gizmo to duplicate, and then rotate it into position. Center the gizmo and mask both cylinders. Next, go ahead and select Polycube from the gear menu. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Turn off dynamic and press delete loops. Reposition the cube and then position it into place. Extrude the face by holding Control and moving with the gizmo. The plan here is to block out the major forms using primitives, then using DynaMesh to continue adding details. Let's run a ZRemesher with double on and the adaptive size set to 50. Pick the knife curve brush and begin cutting in the surface angle changes. Run another ZRemesher with identical settings to add some more polys to the mesh, then keep slicing in the cuts. A cool feature of the knife curve brush is that it adds poly groups to the slices, which is really handy when using keep groups for ZRemesher. With this particular part, I'm not aiming for super clean edges, just a general base to refine later. After the ZRemesher has done its job, double check to make sure the cuts align with your reference. Let's go ahead and mask the model and move the gizmo to the other side. From the gear, select Polycube, invert the mask and split unmasked points. Press delete loops and move the cube into place. Unmask the top face and extrude it with the gizmo. The idea for these two end pieces is to model out the silhouette of the side and get the thickness from the top. Then I'll add some geometry with ZRemesher to cut in my angle changes. Since we're going to DynaMesh everything together, there's no need for pinpoint accuracy at this stage. Our goal is to get things close enough to speed up the sculpting process later on. Next, let's run a ZRemesher with double on and the adaptive size set to 50. Select the knife curve brush and start carving in those surface angle changes. Go ahead and run another ZRemesher with the same settings to add some extra polys to the mesh. And keep slicing in those cuts. Once the blockout is done, let's merge the two end pieces down and select the cylinders. Control-click on the canvas to mask the model, and from the gizmo's gear, select the polyplane primitive. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Rotate it 180 degrees and scale it down in the Y-axis. With the plane in place, switch to the ZBrush and select Insert Multiple Edge Loops. Press W to bring up the gizmo and from its gear, select Bend Arc. Set it to 30 degrees by using the green cone. Remember to hold Shift to snap it to 5-degree increments. After you're happy with it, press Accept. Then we can elevate the plane a bit. Insert 2 edge loops down the middle and Q-mesh it back. Press flip and snap it to the top view. Move the model forward, then unmask the back and add some thickness. Let's go ahead and insert a single edge loop and aim to position it halfway between the 2 cylinders. Go ahead and press Group by Normals, and from the ZModeler brush, select Q-mesh with the target set to Poly Loop and Poly Group. This will Q-mesh the poly loop until it encounters a change in the poly groups. Insert another edge loop at roughly the same distance as the previous one, and then Q-mesh once again. Q-mesh the bottom poly loop out a bit and press QC50. Set the smooth subdivision to 1 and apply dynamic subdivisions. Delete the lower subdivisions and get rid of the extra edge loops. We'll need this extra geometry shortly. Snap it to the top view with symmetry activated in the x-axis. Now select the Clip Curve brush. Let's switch to the Move Infinite Depth brush to push in the vertices for the inward curve. Return to the ZModeler brush and crease the 2 outer edges of the curve. Press Ctrl W to group visible, and select the Move Infinite Depth brush again. With symmetry on in the x-axis, it's time to start shaping the silhouette. Control-click on the canvas to mask the model and bring in a cylinder 3D from the gizmo. Control-click the canvas to invert the mask and split unmasked points. Disable Dynamic and press Ctrl-W to change the polygroup color to anything but white. Let's move it over and scale it to match the reference. Hold Ctrl and move with the gizmo to duplicate. Make sure the gizmo is in the center of the 2 cylinders with local symmetry on. If you're using ZBrush 2023 or a later version, you have a powerful new feature called Dynamic Symmetry. This lets you set the symmetry axis based on the gizmo's position. Now you can Q-mesh the faces together. Remove the middle edge loop and Q-mesh the face upwards, which in my opinion is a quicker way to achieve the desired effect and reduces the chances of snapping misses. Reinsert the edge loop and press QC50. Uncrease the 2 edges. Select the Move Infinite Depth brush and adjust the middle of the mesh to match the reference. Unmask the front faces and add a bit more thickness to them. It's time to merge these 2 subtools and press Ctrl W to group visible. Alright, snap your view to the top. Control and move with the gizmo to duplicate, rotate it 180 degrees and position it into place. Now select Mask Edge Loop Partial for the top edges, then invert the mask. Use the gizmo again to move them back and add a taper. Next, grab the Move Infinite Depth brush, snap it to the front view, and start tucking those ends into the cylinders. Mask the model and bring in a polycube from the gizmo. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Go ahead and disable dynamic and move it to the front. Press delete loops and scale it up a bit. Once we've nailed down the starting base, it's time to extrude upwards using the gizmo. Let's use edge slide to try and keep the faces evenly spaced. Go ahead and move the subtool to the center of the model. Next, center the gizmo and from the gear menu, choose Deform or Soft. Use Ctrl, Alt, and drag to select the top 2 rows of dots, then scale them in. Ctrl and drag to deselect the top row and scale those out slightly. Go ahead and head back up to the gear and press Accept. After you press QC50, mask the model and bring in a cylinder 3D from the gizmo. Invert the mask and then split unmasked points. Press QC50 again and rotate the model by 90 degrees. This cylinder is being set up to be used for a subtractive Boolean. Turn on Solo and grab the extender from the ZBrush. Drag the orange cone downward and press Accept when you're finished. Press QC50 and then Ctrl W to group visible. Move it down into place and click the subtractive icon in the subtool list. Make sure it's positioned below the subtool you're subtracting from, then switch on Live Boolean. Now we're ready to fine-tune the position and scale. Let's turn off Live Boolean and duplicate it using the gizmo. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Rotate it by 90 degrees and position it into place. Mask half the model and move it to the other side. Now let's turn on Live Boolean again to check how it looks. It's time for some last-minute crease adjustments. We can delete the edge loop to exaggerate the slope, then crease the top edge loops. Add a few edge loops to the bottom to help with the crease fall off. For the top piece, set the crease level slider to 3 and add some edge loops down the middle. Let's do the same thing for the cylinders. Set the crease level to 3 and add in some edge loops. For the end pieces, turn on dynamic and set the smooth subdivisions to 2. Time to switch live Booleans on. Bring up the gizmo and click on Transpose all selected subtools. Now we can create a folder and add all the subtools in there. From the gear of the folder, choose Boolean with dynamic subdivisions. This will create a new subtool that's completed the Booleans and maintained our polygroups, while retaining all the original subtools in the folder. Finally, run a DynaMesh utility with blur set to 0, poly count set to 1.5, and use auto scaler switched on. Then we can perform a polish with an open circle to clean up those edges. Alright, let's add some text. Select a new tool by selecting the star in the tool palette. Bring up the gizmo and make sure you're facing Z forward and Y up. Head to the gear and select the polyplane. Drag the red and green cone all the way out till it hits 100 by 100. Next, go to the texture palette and bring in the texture I linked in the description. You can add it to your texture map tab in the tool palette. Open up the UV map tab and do a quick unwrap. Scale it in the x-axis until you hit 1.5. Holding Shift will help you snap it to 0.05 increments. Divide up the plane until you're sitting between 2 to 3 million. Mine's at 2.56 million. Pop over to the Poly Paint tab and select Poly Paint from Texture. Make sure you have either RGB or mRGB enabled. Poly Paint from Texture is going to take the color information from the texture and apply it to the mesh as Poly Paint. We can now turn off our texture from the Texture Map menu. Let's go ahead and press Adjust Colors in the Poly Paint menu. Drag from the first gray square to the red lettering in the viewport. Increase the tolerance to 100 and press OK. Now we can turn off Colorize in the Poly Paint menu to see the masking. Control-click on the canvas to invert the mask. Then press Ctrl-W to assign a polygroup to the masked area. And then clear the mask. Let's go ahead and unmask the words. Blur the mask by Control-clicking on the plane. Then run a Polish by Features with an open circle a couple of times. Control, Shift, and click on the words to isolate the polygroup. Then delete hidden. While we're at it, let's also delete the logo. Set the ZRemesher's adaptive size to 20 and target polygon count to 5, which is really 5,000. Use Shift F to view the wireframe. Now I want to fix that O real quick. Let's center the gizmo in the O and use dynamic symmetry. Enable local symmetry and mirror and weld in the x-axis. Let's hide everything past the O and delete it. Turn on a half and run another ZRemesher. From the ZBrush, let's choose QMesh all polygons to add some thickness. Go back to our original tool and add it to the subtool list using either Insert or Append. The only difference between the two is that Append will always add it to the bottom of the subtool list, while Insert will add it directly below the selected subtool. Position the text in front of the brakes and scale it down a bit. From the gizmo's gear, select Bend Arc. Using the green cone, give it a 20-degree arc. Press Accept from the gizmo to lock it in. Press QC50 and reduce the smooth subdivision down to 2. Press the subtractive icon in the subtool list. Then adjust the depth. Bring the smooth subdivide down to 1 and apply the dynamic subdivision. Delete the lower subdivisions. Select the top subtool and merge it down. Make sure the text polygroup is white, which indicates it's a subtractive mesh, and set your DynaMesh resolution using the picker. Control drag on the canvas to DynaMesh, then run a polish to clean up those edges. Alright, let's turn on local symmetry along with dynamic. Control-Shift-click on the polygroup to isolate it and make sure symmetry is on in the Z-axis. Then place the gizmo in the center of the mesh. Now mask out the sides of your model using the Mask Curve brush. And Control-click on the mesh to blur the mask. In the masking menu located in the tool palette, press Dilute Mask a few times. Our mask seems a tad small. So let's press Grow Mask. Then Control-Alt-click on the mesh to sharpen the mask. Now we can press Ctrl-W to polygroup the masked area. Unmask the new polygroup, then Control-click to blur the mask. Now we can run a Polish by Features with an open circle. Control-drag on the canvas to clear the mask, and with your gizmo active, Control-click on the polygroup to unmask. This time, let's turn off Dynamic from Local Symmetry. Hold Control and move with the gizmo to extrude inwards. Clear the mask by Control-dragging on the canvas. Then do it again to DynaMesh. Any minor wavy flat surfaces or inconsistent edges can be smoothed out with the polish slider. Next up, we need to make an inset cut on top of the cylinders. Turn off local symmetry and grab the Mask Curve brush. Invert the mask and position the gizmo on top of the cylinder. Shift-click the blue arrow to align the camera to the gizmo. We can now use the Clip Circle Center brush to add in our inset. Bring up the Mask Curve brush again and unmask the other cylinder. Shift-click the blue arrow to align the camera to the gizmo, and then add the inset with the Clip Circle Center brush. Control-drag on the canvas to clear the mask, then do it again to DynaMesh. Run a polish to clean up the edges. Select the planar brush to level out the differences in height on the flat surface. Just a reminder, the planar brush flattens parts of your model without creating overlapping geometry. If you click inside a cavity, everything above that height you clicked will be flattened, while alt-clicking will raise to meet the height you clicked at. Okay, now let's select the two end pieces of your model and hide them momentarily. Make sure symmetry is turned on in the x-axis. We're going to start creating separation for the top and bottom part of the break using the mask curve brush. Remember, with symmetry on, we only need to mask a little past the halfway mark. Now it's time to bring back our hidden geometry. From the bottom view, draw the mask curve straight across. Thanks to the new Align to Camera feature in the gizmo, we can set the camera's angle based on the flat surface of the cylinder. This is going to help us get a more accurate mask. Let's do the same for the other side of the mesh. Just a little bit of cleaning left to do. Blur the mask by control-clicking on the model, then invert the mask by control-clicking on the canvas. Press Ctrl-W to assign a polygroup to the masked area. Unmask our new polygroup and blur the mask again. Now you have two options. You can either go to Lightbox and under the Brush tab, select the Smooth Groups brush from the Smooth folder. Or you can go to the Brush palette, navigate to the Smooth Brush modifiers, and find the Weighted Smooth Mode slider. While holding down the Shift key, slide it to 6, which is for Group Borders. This slider offers 10 different smooth options and makes switching between smooth brushes way easier. This is especially handy for custom UIs. The reason I'm choosing to smooth the border instead of running a polish is that I don't want any deformations happening to the unmasked forms. Now let's isolate the polygroup and run an edge loop with crisp turned on and the displacement slider set to -0.003. Unmask the new edge strip and run a polish by features to smooth out any waviness. To clean up the line, you can either use the nudge brush or the move brush. But don't worry about this part too much, because it will be cleaned up during the retopo stage. The final part of this blockout involves making some minor adjustments to the surface with the sculpting brushes. A brush I often use to adjust and manipulate plane changes is the Trim Dynamic brush. But keep in mind, I customize my Trim Dynamic brush a bit, so it might behave slightly different on my screen compared to the default one. But it's not that big of a deal, you can achieve the same results using the default brush as well. After I've made my adjustments and I'm satisfied with the changes, I like to use the polish brush at a low intensity to refine it just a bit more. But remember, we don't need to spend too much time on this step. The low poly retopple will ultimately dictate many of the angle changes and the smoothness.